when it comes to a fight between Chocolatito and Estrada, I think Chocolatito has the advantage in terms of style. But also, it's going to be the culmination of what I think is a long trajectory that saw the super flyweights go into another level in terms of popularity and attention. That first fight was in 2012. We were talking before, you and I, about what network it was on. It was something on Wealth TV that's now AEG TV. I mean, it didn't really have a big TV platform in the United States. It was on Azteca TV in Mexico, and it was at the Sports Arena in Los Angeles. And it wasn't even the main event. Brian Valoria was the main event in that fight of the Chocolatito versus Estrada first fight. And a few years later, because of guys like Tom Loeffler and the HBO dates that they were getting, they started to give more attention to the super flyweights and the flyweights with those flyweight cards featuring the four kings of that division: Cuadras, Brunvisai, Estrada, and Chocolatito, really in 2015, 2016, 2017. And of course, by fighting on those Triple G undercards, the super flyweight started getting a lot of attention as well. And it almost culminated in a kind of performance where you have the big rematch in front of a big crowd, and finding them getting that payoff with these two stars fighting each other. But it took place during the pandemic. So it was really restricted. It took place in March in 2021, the rematch. Estrada won the fight. Chocolatito felt that he won, but it didn't have that kind of it didn't have that cherry on top of it being in front of a large crowd with a big TV platform. But now it will. It'll be on a Matchroom card, big platform on DAZN. It's one of the biggest cards that to end the year, and it'll finally be in front of a huge crowd because it's no longer taking place during the confines of the shutdowns of the pandemic. So I think it's a culmination not only of their trilogy, but of a long history of the super flyweights not getting a lot of attention in 2012, but slowly, little by little, getting that big attention, getting the big TV dates and large crowds.
Welcome back to the RBR Recap, episode 29. It is Monday, September 5, Labor Day weekend. I'm Alex Burgos, joined as always by my man, Gabe Rivas. Gabe, how are you, sir, on this holiday Monday?
I'm fine. I think I got some allergies, but I'm okay. It's Labor Day, but we stay working, man.
Yeah, stay working. Yeah, and we had some fights, man. They were working on Saturday and Sunday. We're going to kick things off with Juan Francisco Estrada, the return after 18 months out of the ring, after his big victory over Chocolatito Gonzalez in their second fight, a fight that many thought could have gone the other way, myself included. But regardless, he got the official victory. And since then, we haven't seen him. I think he got COVID, might have been injured here and there. There were things that happened to him outside of the ring. And so he returned against Argy Cortes. And it was supposed to be a fight, a homecoming fight for Estrada to kind of, probably work out the ring rust and then set up a trilogy with Chocolatito Gonzalez. And, at the end of the day, Estrada did get the victory by unanimous decision over Cortes. But there were spots, especially at the beginning, where you thought, okay, this might be tougher, than what we expected. Cortes had his moments. He was dropped by a well-placed, vicious body shot by Estrada as he started to kind of get rolling in the middle of the later rounds, round 7, I think it was. And then that kind of the lingering effects allowed Estrada to really take it home. But he did get, hit cleanly. Again, I said 18 months out of the ring, probably working off some of that ring rust, but I'm sure Chocolatito was at home, salivating like, yeah, I'm ready for this trilogy, because for as well as, he was kind of written off going into that second fight against Estrada, but, we've seen what he's done lately and he's looked as good as ever. So I'm sure he can't wait to get back in. And, we have an official date now, December 3, for that trilogy fight. That's going to be super exciting. But let's talk a little bit about what Estrada did against Cortes. Gabe, what did you think and how Estrada looked?
Estrada was coming off a long layoff, and it really looked like it. He was getting hit a lot. He did manage to land a body shot that weakened him, and that was it ended up being a very fruitful investment because it slowed him down and allowed him to work. He did have the hometown advantage, and that may have worked in his favor. There was also the issue of open scoring, and that perhaps works in your favor as well, because you know what you need to do in the later rounds. Because I think during the 8th round, they made an announcement about how the scorecards looked at the time, and perhaps it allowed him to tighten up and finish strong. Although some of those later rounds, I think Cortes won because of his activity. But Estrada did look like he was coming that like this was a tune-up fight to make sure that he was in shape, that he can do 12 rounds for a Chocolatito fight. He almost lost his fight. It was a close call, and that's the danger in taking a tune-up fight before a big fight. But you can see that he really needed it, because in order to fight someone like Chocolatito, you have to be in perfect shape to deal with the pace that he fights at. So he didn't look the best, but it was a tune-up fight that he needed in order to have this Chocolatito fight in December.
Yeah, and I mean, do you think that we can't really invest too much, attention, and we can't really take too much out of this fight just because of the long layoff? I mean, because if you think, what have you done for me lately? It's like I said previously, Chocolatito's looked great, Estrada, but also that long layoff. So, who would you favor going into that trilogy fight in December?
I would favor Chocolatito going into the trilogy fight because he's looked so good recently. He has been more active, whereas Estrada was coming off a long layoff before this fight. And as you mentioned, what have you done recently with Chocolatito? He's had a career resurgence, and he's looked really great. He looked really great in his fight against Martinez. And I think he was the one who really wanted to do the trilogy fight ASAP, whereas with Estrada, I think he wanted to do this tune-out fight to make sure he was prepared. But going into the fight, I would have Chocolatito because of his style, because of his activity, because he's looked good he's looked good recently. And with Estrada, he does have the youth advantage. He's like 2 or 3 years younger. That's going to help him in the fight. But I would going into this fight, I would have Chocolatito as a favorite.
Yeah, I agree. And it's interesting because stylistically, you would think like a guy that fights like Chocolatito, being older as well, you would maybe think there's more wear and tear on him. But yeah, like you mentioned, he's looked great as of late. And I really thought Chocolatito won the second fight. And who knows, maybe that took a little bit more out of Gallo than it did out of Chocolatito. It was kind of like another day at the office for Chocolatito. And, Estrada took a lot of punches, as did Chocolatito in that fight. But, different guys react different ways. And so I think definitely with that long layoff, he needed this tune-up, this get-back fight and getting his bearings back in the ring. But again, I would favor Chocolatito in what should be, we expect to be another great fight.
And it's a question of styles, right? Because Estrada ended up being so Rungvisai in their rematch, whereas with Chocolatito, he lost badly, especially in the rematch, but he lost both fights against Rungvisai because of the style. Rungvisai seemed to punch in between Chocolatito's punches, whereas Chocolatito likes the guy to throw his punches and stop so that he can counter. And I think that we saw that Estrada is still open to counters after he finishes punching. That's how Cortes was able to land some shots on him. So I think the question of styles is going to be a factor. I think Chocolatito, when it comes to a fight between Chocolatito and Estrada, I think Chocolatito has the advantage in terms of style. But also, it's going to be the culmination of what I think is a long trajectory that saw the super flyweights go into another level in terms of popularity and attention. That first fight was in 2012. We were talking before, you and I, about what network it was on. It was something on Wealth TV that's now AEG TV. I mean, it didn't really have a big TV platform in the United States. It was on Azteca TV in Mexico, and it was at the Sports Arena in Los Angeles, and it wasn't even the main event. Brian Valoria was the main event in that fight of the Chocolatito versus Estrada first fight. And a few years later, because of guys like Tom Loeffler and the HBO dates that they were getting, they started to give more attention to the super flyweights and the flyweights with those flyweight cards featuring the four kings of that division: Cuadras, Rungvisai, Estrada, and Chocolatito, really in 2015, 2016, 2017. And of course, by fighting on those Triple G undercards, the super flyweights started getting a lot of attention as well. And it almost culminated in a kind of performance where you have the big rematch in front of a big crowd, and finally them getting that payoff with these two stars fighting each other. But it took place during the pandemic. So it was really restricted. It took place in March in 2021, the rematch. Estrada won the fight. Chocolatito felt that he won, but it didn't have that kind of it didn't have that cherry on top of it being in front of a large crowd with a big TV platform. But now it will. It'll be on a Matchroom card, a big platform on DAZN. It's one of the biggest cards that to end the year, and it'll finally be in front of a huge crowd because it's no longer taking place during the confines of the shutdowns of the pandemic. So I think it's a culmination not only of their trilogy, but of a long history of the super flyweights not getting a lot of attention in 2012, but slowly, little by little, getting that big attention, getting the big TV dates and large crowds.
Yeah, and I got to give a hat tip to Tom Loeffler from back in those days, like you were mentioning, that gave them that platform. Obviously, I think Brian Viloria, the Hawaiian Punch, he was fun to watch, but he kind of got that tail end of the resurgence, and his better days were behind him by that point. I remember, as I mentioned to you, one of the first times I saw Estrada on TV, where I didn't have to go look for like a YouTube fight or a clip. Like with the Chocolatito fight, it's how I watched it, was on YouTube. But Viloria and Estrada was a really good fight, and that was on TV, I think, on a Macau undercard for Manny Pacquiao. But just kind of like, not a main event, not a co-main or anything like that, but you could actually just watch it. And then with Loeffler bringing those guys in, like you mentioned, we got to see them in action, a round robin of sorts, and just like the best fighting the best. And now Matchroom has carried that torch, and now these guys are still fighting at a high level. And like you said, we finally get to see with the crowd, with the environment, with the excitement, with the buildup, how it should be. And there's guys, I got to give a hat tip also to Cortes. He's another guy. I mean, he made good on his word, said I'm coming to fight. He brought it to Estrada, and he's a guy that he should get another opportunity. He was a fun watch, and in a busy division, a small action-packed division like the Flies and the Super Flies, definitely you want to see that type of style, a guy that could take a punch, give a punch, and if he goes down, he gets back up. Even with a few losses on his record, didn't have the name coming in, but I think now a lot of people know who he is.
Throw him in there with Bam Rodriguez. I didn't know this
Exactly.
until I was looking the records, but Cortes actually handed Bam Rodriguez's September 17 opponent his first loss, Israel Gonzalez. So
Yep, that's what they were mentioning. Yeah,
that could be a potential opponent for Bam Rodriguez. And Bam Rodriguez, to end this note about the super flyweights, that's the heir to the throne. That's going to be the king of the flyweights and the super flyweights in this next generation. So it'll be interesting to see how DAZN and Matchroom deal with this next generation of super flyweight talents, being led by guys like Bam Rodriguez.
Also, this past weekend, we had an exciting heavyweight matchup between Andy Ruiz and Luis Ortiz, two guys that can punch, two guys that have been, at the forefront of the heavyweight division for a little while, especially Ortiz. It ended up being a unanimous decision victory, a close one for Andy Ruiz, who took the fight 114-111 on two cards, and then 113-112. He scored 3 knockdowns of Luis Ortiz, who now in back-to-back fights has hit the canvas more than once, twice against Charles Martin, which was really surprising, and then now 3 times against Andy Ruiz. And I think we see his age is obviously catching up to him. He's 43, so in Cuban years he's probably like 72. But all jokes aside, he is an older heavyweight, and he's been around the block. I mean, he spent a lot of time, Golden Boy, even with Matchroom, where he was looking for that marquee fight and just never really got it. Wasn't until Deontay Wilder and he joined PBC that he was able to get that fight. Wasn't in 2 exciting fights, high-level fights with Deontay Wilder, and just couldn't get the victory. And so now, he's really old. You can see his legs are not what they used to be, and his punch resistance isn't. But he's got the heart of a champion, and he got up and he did his best to try and box Andy Ruiz, which is definitely the recipe and the style that you need. We saw Anthony Joshua revert to that in their rematch and had success. We saw Joseph Parker do it when he beat Ruiz. And, I think that with Andy Ruiz, he had his most success when he was active. I think in CompuBox stats, it was 6-5 in rounds for Ortiz, and then 1 round was tied, the 4th, I believe, in terms of punch output. He just is not active enough, especially when you start considering some of the other matchups that could take place in the heavyweight division. So a good victory for him. But, now looking forward, you start to think, okay, if we're sizing up matchups against some of the other top guys in the heavyweight division, how would it go for Ruiz? And maybe not well if he's fighting the style that he did last night, where he's like a lot of lulls in the action. Because when he lets his hands go, he's definitely got the fastest hands in the heavyweight division. I mean, to me, there's no question, no doubt about that. You just like to see him be more active. And I think even, before when he looked a little heavier, and he's like that didn't deter him from really letting his hands go and being, bobbing and weaving, getting on the inside. It seems like now maybe he's, I don't know, changing his style a little bit. And so he's gone through obviously a few different trainers. But Gabe, what'd you think about the fight, Andy Ruiz versus Luis Ortiz, how that went, and then just kind of, looking ahead for what could be potentially next for Andy Ruiz?
when Andy Ruiz could cut the distance, land some shots, and look dominant, then he was dominant when he had his moments. But there are also many moments where Luis Ortiz would use his very hard, long right jab and control the fight and keep his distance. So the moments where Andy Ruiz was able to, land those counter shots and knock Ortiz down, he looked great. But there are too many moments when he wasn't doing enough. And like you mentioned, it's going to be very tough against the other top heavyweights in the division. And also, aside from the fact that he isn't that active in terms of punch output, when he was able to hurt Ortiz and he was trying to come forward and land more shots and try to end the fight, he would pull back too straight and Ortiz would catch him with the straight left hand. So when he has his opponent hurt and he's trying to land shots, he's susceptible to getting countered because of a hurt fighter is a very dangerous fighter. And if you're throwing your shots and trying to finish him while pulling straight back, you can get hit with something really hard and get knocked out. Like
I think
Ortiz.
we saw in the first Joshua fight when Ruiz was kind of letting the combination go. That's when he got dropped.
Exactly. So what does that tell me? Well, as you were saying as well, he's going to have a tough time against the top fighters in the division, especially against guys who hold the belts. Now, as they were mentioning in the post-fight interview, perhaps he'll be fighting Deontay Wilder if he can get past his next opponent. If that's the case, it's number one, it's hard for him to cut the distance. Number two, it's hard for him to stay active enough to land significant punches. And let's say he does hurt Deontay Wilder at some point. He goes in, he looks for the kill. Deontay Wilder lands a wild right hand and it's over. He cannot risk coming in crazily against someone like Deontay Wilder. And then also with Luis Ortiz, it's an interesting mix because he's tall and he can box, but he's also a southpaw, right? So it's like, all right, against a tall fighter, he's going to have some trouble. Who's very tall? Who's much taller? Tyson Fury. Against a southpaw, he's going to have some trouble. Who's a southpaw and has really good boxing skills? Alexander Usyk. So I think he's going to have a real tough time against the two top heavyweights in the division, Usyk and Fury, because he's not active enough and he gets a little reckless when he's trying to hurt and finish his opponent.
You know, there will be difficulties in trying to capture another title, which is what he said he wants to do, but it doesn't take away from the fact that he's an exciting fighter to watch when he's active, like you mentioned. Speaking of activity, not in the fight, but just career activity, he says he wants to fight like 3 to 4 times. So, you know, we got guys like Joseph Parker fighting Joe Joyce. So, you know, there's other fighters out there. There's, you know, Dillian White, guys that could potentially be exciting fights. Now, of course, in-house, if Deontay Wilder does get past Robert Helenius, like you mentioned, which is no gimme. We haven't seen Wilder back, you know, since the trilogy, and Helenius is on a winning streak. So, you know, depends what happens in that fight. But Andy Ruiz does have some exciting prospects and, you know, could market himself as, you know, one of the most exciting, you know, heavyweights to see and still get some big victories, you know, if he's able to get into fights, like we said, with Wilder and maybe some of these other guys as well. But outside of, you know, Fury and Usyk is what I'm talking about, because those guys need to fight. The titles need to find a home. And then from there, maybe we'll see, okay, he moves up in the rankings and can challenge for one of those belts. But it's going to be difficult. Yeah. So, I mean, for anybody, for me, it's always the size when you start thinking about a Tyson Fury fight, just because he can fight. He's very fluid. He can fight on the inside. He can obviously box you. And, you know, like we mentioned previously, it's not like Joshua, who has size, but then has to really make a concerted effort to try to even use that size. I feel like Fury just knows that he can do anything, regardless of the size, regardless of the distance. And we know that Ruiz is going to want to get inside, cut that distance. And I think maybe he might be able to find some success against Wilder, because, you know, Wilder will want to keep him at bay at that distance where you can land that big bomb. But I think as long as Ruiz is consistent with his movement, staying off the line, and, you know, throws punches and combinations, and then either gets out of range or stays in the pocket close, and he can maybe have some success against Wilder. But, you know, again, it remains to be seen. But I think all in all, a good victory for him.
Yeah, good victory. And hopefully he can stay active and fight a few more times, because, yeah, he hadn't fought since May of 2021. So that definitely has to be a factor. And if he can get 1 or 2 fights in before the Deontay Wilder fight, then perhaps he can be a little bit more active, not just in terms of how many fights, but how many punches he can throw per round.
Thank you for listening to the RBR Recap. Make sure to follow us on social media at RBR Recap. And visit RBRRecap.com for the latest episodes.